Welcome back as we move toward finishing up the first year of world history through the end of the Middle Ages. Next year, you'll start off with the Renaissance, but for now, we're finishing up the end of the Middle Ages, and at the risk of a spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. You knew this was coming. By now, a lot of the story of world history throughout the first half of our year, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, to Greece, to Rome, to the end of the Roman Empire, to the early Middle Ages, a lot of our story has been the rise and fall of civilizations. You get a period of rise, a golden age, and then it comes crashing down. Sometimes there's a very long period of golden age. Rome lasted for 1,000 years. It came crashing down. Egypt lasts for a couple thousand years. It comes crashing down to the Sea Raiders. Well, the Middle Ages have another period of optimism. The Central Middle Ages, this time of romance. We talked about the change in attitude from the earlier Middle Ages, where you have a lot of pessimism, a lot of a sense that there are monsters all around, that life is just something to struggle through, to keep your head down, to stay home, and just to get through it. Well, as you move out of the time of the Viking invasions, as you move toward the time of the High Middle Ages, the 1100s, the 1200s, life starts to look up. And there are some major accomplishments during the High Middle Ages that you've seen. Agricultural revolution leads to economic surpluses, leads to the revival of towns and trade. The revival of towns means you can have specialization, which means you can have great buildings built. The great buildings of the Middle Ages, of course, are the cathedrals. You have more travel, the Crusades, European nobility going off thousands of miles into a complete wilderness, all on the romantic quest of reconquering the Holy Land. You have more pilgrimage. There's more travel. The universities form in this time period, the beginning of the universities we ourselves have today. As students from all over Europe travel to these universities on a quest of their own, the quest for knowledge and understanding, the quest for the new philosophy, the Renaissance, the rebirth of Greek learning. You also have new forms of religious life, the arrival of the Franciscans, a new group of monks who don't stay in a monastery. Instead, to them, the whole world is their monastery. They represent this attitude of romance, of life as a journey and a quest. And even the cathedrals have this too. And this sums up an attitude of life as a sort of quest, life as an adventure. You know enough now to know that when there is a golden age, it comes crashing down. And that is true in this case too. So we're going to have two videos. This video is going to give the very beginnings, the beginning signs that something is going wrong. And then the next short video will be the something that really goes spectacularly wrong, the bubonic plague. Now, the crash doesn't happen all at once. There are signs coming to people who are paying attention. Most people don't, then as now. But there are signs that something's not right. It's almost like the medievals reached too far, that their sense of optimism went too far. Let's go back to the cathedrals for a minute. The cathedrals were magnificent accomplishments, the skyscrapers of their day. But what happens is they reach too far. The skyscrapers build too high. In 1284, a group of them set out to build the tallest cathedral ever built before, the tallest cathedral of the entire Middle Ages, the Beauvais Cathedral. It was supposed to be this magnificent human accomplishment. Enormous space for stained glass windows, taller than any cathedral to that date. It collapses in the year 1284. They had built it too high. They had built it far too high without enough buttresses. You see, the flying buttresses that we talked about help support the walls, but if you make them too thick, it blocks light from coming in. So they tried to make the flying buttresses thinner and thinner and thinner till if you look at the ones in that cathedral, you can barely see them. Well, by building so high and having too thin supports, what happened is the wind simply, the cathedral cannot stand up to the wind over time. The walls can no longer support the weight of the roof, can no longer stand up to the wind. Most of the cathedral is blown over. You notice the part that's blown over is that long part of it, the part where it would not have stood up to wind. The part that survives is the narrower part where there's a cross piece. Well, maybe on its own this didn't mean much. But when people looked back, it looks like the collapse of this cathedral is a sign that Europeans were reaching too hard and too far, that maybe there was even a certain arrogance in their confidence, that maybe their confidence was becoming overconfidence. Some people have wondered if the burning of Notre Dame, Paris last year could be a similar sign. Who knows? More serious problem is the fall of the Knights Templar. Now you remember the Knights Templar. They arise during this time period of crusade, right? Out of this need to defend the Holy Land. You've conquered the Holy Land, but you need to defend it. So you have this new kind of monk, the military monks, the Templar Knights. Now the Templar Knights are tremendously successful, tremendously popular, which leads to a problem. When you're popular, people want to give you stuff. And so people give them money. They actually develop a very sophisticated banking organization. And as a group that's sitting on a lot of money, this makes them a target. Specifically, it makes them a target for the local government, the King of France. By 1300, the King of France needs money. He's looking at the Templars and trying to figure out how he can get their money for himself. And so the French king, Philip IV, sometimes called Philip the Fair, supposedly he was very good looking, he accused the Templars of a whole series of horrible made-up things. He accused them of worshiping the devil, of engaging in diabolic orgies, of doing black magic. And because no one was going to believe this without evidence, he has them tortured into confessing. And when they do confess under torture, he kills many of them, he takes all their money, and the Pope can't do a thing about it. This is the growth of government power used against the Knights Templar. And it's another sign that one of the great accomplishments, in a sense, of the Middle Ages, this creation of a knightly ideal, not that every Templar was a perfect knight, of course, but what was important was the ideal that they represented. That this could be destroyed so easily, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Again, it seems like a sign that trouble is coming. Now, if this sounds very abstract, there's a more specific sign of trouble coming. And this is the third big thing before we get to the plague. Global cooling. You remember that the medieval revival started out with a case of global warming. In fact, warming that was so significant that swamps in Europe dry out. The growing season grows longer. Wet, swampy land is drier. Places that were too cool to farm in England, in Northern Europe, suddenly have longer growing seasons. Well, all this is great because it means you can produce more crops. People are better fed. They're healthier. Well, if you remember, I said this warm period lasts from 800 to 1300. Now we're in 1300. The medieval warm period ends, and for the next 500 years, Europe goes through what's called a little ice age. The summers get shorter, cooler, wetter. The winters get harsher, longer. There's more swampland. And what this does is it's the reverse of what happened in the warm period. With the growing seasons shorter, you can't produce as much food. With shorter summers, you can't produce as much food. The winters are worse. This doesn't help. So not only can you not produce enough food to feed people, you can't produce enough food to feed oxen. All of the rain, see, some rain is good. Too much rain, it drowns the crops. They just rot. There's one place in, I think, England where, according to records one year, it rained something like 50 plus days in a row. Like they can't grow crops. You have famine. Year after year, you have famine. From 1300, 1315, you have the worst famine Europe had seen in 1,000 years. So bad that 10% of Europe dies. 10% of Europe dies from that famine alone. Most of their animals, most of the animals they were raising die too. It's called the Great Dying. 90% of the herds are dead because when there's barely enough food to feed you, you can't afford to be giving food to your herds. But the problem is not just that the survivors, not just that 10% of Europe is dead. The problem is those who survive are less healthy. They're less well nourished. And when people are less healthy, less well fed, they're more vulnerable to disease. And that is what comes next.